Hello, I'm Paul Mathers, and I thought I would take a few moments and do a video book review of Richard Ellman's biography of James Joyce, which I've recently read. It is the gold standard of James Joyce biographies. As you can see, it's quite long. It's about 800 pages. And as so often happens with these towering literary figures who have a decided persona, there forms a sort of cult around the figure, of which in James Joyce's case I suppose I am an adherent. About 2 years ago, I gave in to my irritating impulse to read extremely difficult works of literature and took on James Joyce's Ulysses, which I enjoyed immensely and would highly recommend to everybody. I think it is unduly considered a difficult work of literature. It's a wonderful, joyous book, and after which, heartened by the joy I got from reading it, I went on to read all of the major and many of the minor works of James Joyce that I could find. I held off for some time in reading Ellman's biography of Joyce, and I still feel as if I were right in doing so. Joyce writes highly autobiographical material, which he sort of poeticizes and heroicizes. And in doing so, I feel that he attempts to make the specific universal. He tries to take specific instances from his own life and make them about the human experience, which is something that I greatly appreciate. And I didn't want knowing too much about his biography and somebody's specific directional force of his biography to color the way in which I read Joyce. So I held off on reading this. I feel that Ellman wrote a really wonderful biography. It's sort of like taking a upper division university course on the subject. Afterward, you may not be a scholar on the subject at hand, but you will certainly be the most knowledgeable person at the cocktail party about the subject at hand. But I feel that some of the weak points were that Ellman tends to side with Joyce in everything. I think anybody who knows anything about James Joyce would agree that he seems to have been a bit of a difficult man. Ellman would, at the appropriate times, lead the reader to take Joyce's side against William Butler Yeats, Ezra Pound at times, Joyce's wife and children and own family, his patrons, the very people who brought his work to the world stage. Because at that particular point in the story, James Joyce was having difficulty with them. An example that I would pull from this is Oliver Gogarty, who is the real-life inspiration for Buck Mulligan in Ulysses. Gogarty had James Joyce crash at his house for a while, and after a time decided that he might like to invite James Joyce to leave. In a, admittedly, very dramatic way. But Ellman's retelling of the story would have us take the side of Joyce against Gogarty. Ellman seems to present Gogarty as somebody who's on the wrong side of history, who is a footnote in literary history, whose position is simply the man who threw James Joyce out of his house. I don't think that's entirely fair, because in reading that, I kept thinking it probably was difficult having James Joyce crash on your couch. I think that also one of the points that I would say about Ellman is that he can be very specific. I'm not exactly sure that I'm a better human being for knowing what specific songs James Joyce sang at particular dinner parties, but then there would be moments where he would throw out something that sounded very interesting and he wouldn't follow it up, and unfortunately Ellman is no longer around for us to pursue this. For example, he mentions near the end that James Joyce helped some people escape the Nazis into England and Ireland, and I think that is pretty close to the sentence all of the information that Ellman gives you. And I read that and thought, boy, that sounds like a really interesting story. I wonder if it's a hiding in the wall kind of situation, or did James Joyce just pick up a phone and use his name to get some people some visas? What happened there? But Ellman doesn't tell us. I think that if somebody were interested in James Joyce, who had never read him before, my recommendation for them, and I've made a flow chart, a timeline, would be to read his major works in the order in which they were written. Start with Dubliners, move on to Portrait, Ulysses, and then you might go on to a wonderful biography by Kevin Birmingham, The Most Dangerous Book. It is a biography of the publication of Ulysses. It's a wonderful book, and I'm glad that I read it before the Ellman. I think it sort of prepared me for what was to come. And you may then want to read some of the minor works, Chamber Music, Exiles, and so on, and then move on to the Ellman, maybe another reading of Ulysses with a commentary, and finally there's another wonderful book put out by Oxford World Classics of James Joyce's occasional critical and political writing, which is great fun to read, and the Oxford World Classics always puts out a wonderful edition with great footnotes. If I could subscribe to their publications, I would. At some point here, after you've done the major works, you may want to try and tackle Finnegan's Wake. I tried, and I stalled out, and I say that without shame. So that was my experience with reading Ellman's biography. Stay tuned. I intend on making more book-related YouTube videos in the very near future. Thank you for watching. Ta-ta.